Hi, community gardener. I am going to talk to you about what it means to fork your plot and how to plant your 10% crop, including applying compost. To begin with, you need to know your plot dimensions. So it's really important that you know that your plot measures 6 feet wide by 50 feet long. And so you don't want to make that measurement just irrelevant to anyone else's plot in the garden. So when you measure your 6 feet, make sure that you go down a few plots to either side and measure that that plot has a 2-foot wide path before you start measuring your 6 feet. And also, if you have any borders in your plot, make sure that it's 6 feet from the outside edge of your border to the outside edge of your border, okay? So that you have a full 2 feet of bed. And again, just make sure that when you measure, that you measure a few paths over and include so that you get a sense of where your bed is in the whole row. Because if you just measure your 6 feet, you may be off by 6 inches or something to this one side or the other. So that's pretty important. Also, your bed shouldn't be longer than 50 feet. We need to make sure that we have plenty of pathway in the middle of the rows. And then your donation plot is the first 5 feet on the south end if you're in the B and C row, and on the north end if you're in the A row. What does it mean when I say fork your plot and add compost? Well, to begin, you're going to take a digging fork. It's got wide tines, just a slight arc, not a composting fork, which has round, short tines that are sharp. And you're going to start by placing that fork in the ground every few inches and just gently pulling back. And I keep my knees bent and my hips pulled back so that I'm not bending over and hurting my back or just using my upper body strength. I'm using my whole body to pull that back. And I'm going to do that. And what this is doing is it's aerating and opening up the bed. And you don't want to turn the soil, because in a handful of healthy soil, there are more microorganisms than there are on planet Earth, than there are people on planet Earth. So there's more microorganisms in healthy garden soil, and a handful of it, than there are people on planet Earth. And so you want to make sure that you keep the soil layers in the order that they naturally form, because those micro and macro organisms are inhabiting specific places in your soil. So you don't want to stir it or turn it. You just want to open it up so that water can get in there and oxygen can get in there too. So I'm going to do this to the whole section, just loosening up the soil. And then the other thing this does is it makes it really easy for the weeds to come out, because the soil's nice and loose now. So I can just get in here and quickly pull out these weeds. And there is quite a bit of mugwort in this bed. And so I will probably put these weeds in our invasive windrow and not add them to the compost. And sometimes to get the mugwort out takes a little bit of another forking, but even then, with good forking technique, that mugwort will come right out. And then I can take my fork now, and where I have just any clods of soil, I can just let the digging fork fall and break open that soil and get a nice fine tilt. And I can even use it to move back and forth to just level out that bed. And so I'm going to do that across the whole 10% area, or you can also use this technique to plant your personal plot. But keep in mind, another principle of healthy soil is to keep it covered and to also keep living roots in it at all times. So I'm not going to do this to my plot until I know that I'm ready to plant my crops in here, because there's absolutely no reason to clean out your garden bed and leave this soil exposed because the microorganisms rely on the plants to feed them. The plants produce 60% of their carbohydrates to feed the microorganisms in the soil. So most of what a plant is photosynthesizing and growing and producing is to feed the microorganisms. So if you take away those living plants, you now take away your soil fertility because the microorganisms will die without that food. And it's the microorganisms that are providing you with the minerals and the nutrients to feed your plants, which your plants then feed you. So it's really important that unless you're planting more crops, don't clean out your plot yet. So when you've gotten your bed forked and tilting is when you're breaking up the soil surface, you should be able to effortlessly put your fork anywhere in your bed and the soil will be nice and loose. That means your roots can go deep for water, deep for nutrients. Your next step is to come in and put on compost. So compost is your fertilizer. This is what's going to feed your plants throughout the growing season. And we apply compost ideally once in the fall and again in the springtime. And so also ideally, you sift your compost. We have another video on how to do that. And you have this beautiful black gold to put on your bed. And so you're going to put about 1 inch to 2 inches of compost on your entire 10% plot. And then just smooth that out so it's nice and even. And now it's time to plant your starts. So one key part I forgot to mention is that if your compost moisture is noticeably wetter than your garden plot soil, then you want to make sure that you water your plot. So you want to moisten the whole plot before applying the compost. That's going to help the compost marry with your garden soil. And you really don't need to mix this compost in very much to your garden soil. You can just kind of lay it on top. You might mix it in a little bit with your hands into the top inch or so, but that's about it. You really, again, from the point of healthy soil fertility, building soil fertility, you don't want to disturb the soil. You want to disturb it as little as possible. So we're just building organic matter on top of your bed year after year after year. So to plant starts, I brought an assortment of starts that you might have the pleasure of planting here in your 10% plot. And so the first one is anything in the mustard family. So that's going to be broccoli, collards, kale, cabbage, anything like that. And you'll notice how this plant has a really long neck. You'll also notice perhaps that the plant is what we call root bound. So the roots are growing in a spiral because the plant's been in the start tray for too long. So the first thing we're going to do is root prune. And that means we're literally going to pinch off that coil of roots at the base of the plant. That's going to stimulate the plant to grow more roots and for those roots to go into the ground. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to look and see if there's any yellow or weak leaves. Even just these 2 lower leaves, it's sometimes worth just pinching off because that's also going to stimulate some growth in the plant. And these first leaves down low that first produced when the seedling sprouted, oftentimes they become yellow and diseased pretty much within a week of transplanting. So it's almost better to prune a little below and prune a little above. And then the next rule is plant deeply. And I generally don't hold the plant by the neck right here. That's the most sensitive part of the plant. So you'll tend to see me hold the plant by the leaves or by the root ball. And so now, because your garden bed is so beautifully forked, you can just use your hands to plant. And you're going to open up a nice big hole, and you're going to tuck your start in so that entire neck all the way up to the leaves is covered and supported by soil. Because wind and like the sun and the wind on the neck of the plant makes it really, really weak. And so by supporting it during this early stage of transition into the bud, makes for a much stronger transplant. Timing is also really important. This time of year, the plants are a little more resilient, or the sun isn't as intense in the sky, but still, it's better to transplant your plant starts early in the morning and water them in, or transplant them in the late afternoon and water them in deeply. You want to give them a good inch of water so that the soil moisture meets any moisture that's already in the plot. So you water and then you check. You pull the soil open and make sure that any watering that you've done has met deep water that's in the bed itself. Spacing is next. And so I want to talk about how close can you plant these plants. Well, a broccoli plant needs about a square foot of growing space. So you're going to give it a good foot between plants. And so you're going to plant your next broccoli plant, again, root pruning, pruning off leaves, planting it deeply, and about a foot apart. And you'll notice in my instructions, I'll often say, stagger plant your crops. And by that I mean that you don't plant them in rows, but rather you plant them staggered in rows. So my next broccoli plant would go right here, halfway between these two, because you can pack them in a little closer when you interplant in rows. So I would have one here, and one here, and one here. And then the next row over would match this first row. So the next plant would go here, like so. And that's the same for all the starts. You can stagger them in rows. And then what happens is the spacing just changes. So if we were planting lettuce instead in this plot, you can plant lettuce really, really closely together. Lettuce plants, in fact, there's 2 lettuce plants in this plug, and that's entirely fine for lettuce to grow close together like this. And you can plant lettuce about 8 inches apart. So you might plant a lettuce plant instead. You might plant 2 lettuce plants that close together, okay? And then you might have your next one right there. So a lot more lettuce. You can plant like 4 lettuce in the same amount of space that you might plant 1 broccoli. And then finally, I wanted to demonstrate chard and fennel. So oftentimes in chard or the broccolis or the collards, the kales, when we get our starts, sometimes there'll be more than 1 start in a cell plug. And that's the instance here with this chard. And because we want the chard to go to full maturity and get to be a full-grown plant, it needs about a square foot of growing space, each plant. So you're going to take your thumbs and you're going to press into the soil plug and gently tease it apart. And now you have 2 starts, and you will plant these now 1 foot apart, staggered rows. And so we have fennel, and I've encouraged everyone to plant fennel and lettuce in their plots this season. And so with the fennel, same thing. You want to cover that neck. You want to make sure that you plant so that the bulb, the base of the fennel plant, is nestled into the soil. And fennel can also go quite close. They can be about 8 inches apart. And so it would look like this in your plot, nice and tucked in, nice and supported. But not to worry, you do not need to remember the spacing for all of these starts on this video, because there will always be instructions on the dry erase board in the barn as to what to plant in your 10% and the spacing. What you need to remember is how to prepare your plot, which means forking and weeding it, don't disturb the soil, and then making sure that you apply 1 to 2 inches generously of compost, and then you plant deeply and water deeply. And the other key to watering is that you water deeply but infrequently. So that means that you give it a nice deep soaking of 1 inch of water, and then you do that again in about 4 to 5 days, and then you can slowly back off as the plant matures to about once a week. Here is a great example of a beautifully spaced, beautifully planted bed of lettuce. And here's another great example of just how many heads of lettuce you can pack into one 10% plot. Here's a great example of a plot that has been interplanted with scallions and kohlrabi. The two crops can grow beautifully together. The scallions will take up more vertical space. The kohlrabi will take up more root space. And we can harvest these at different stages so that they can coexist here in this bed really beautifully together. And here's a beautifully planted bed of romaine lettuce, but you notice there's quite a bit of spaces between the rows. And so here's a great example for where you could come back if we had a donation of scallions and plant rows of scallions in between those beds, those heads of lettuce. Lettuce in particular is a really fast-growing start. We can probably harvest the lettuce within 2 to 4 weeks after you have put it in the ground. Your 10% plot may not seem like much on its own, but collectively, all of us together in our 10% plots are growing nearly 1,000 pounds of fresh, nutritious greens for Bounty and Soul every year. And together with our donation plots over by the barn, we grow close to 5. Last year, we even hit 6,000 pounds of fresh produce delivered to Bounty and Soul and to folks in need in our community. Thank you for helping us meet our mission of growing, educating, and sharing.